The holidays are all about sharing with family. Meals, couches, stories, grandma's secret pecan pie recipe. And now you can also share a cart with Instacart's family carts. Everyone can add what they want to one group cart from wherever they are. So you don't have to go from room to room to find out who wants cranberry sauce, or whether you should get mini marshmallows for the yams, or collecting votes for sugar cookies versus shortbread. Just share a cart, and then share the meals and the moments. Download the Instacart app and get delivery in as fast as 30 minutes, plus enjoy free delivery on your first 3 orders. Service fees and terms apply.
Nobody does selling better than Shopify, home of the #1 checkout on the planet. The Shop Pay feature even boosts conversions up to 50%. So if you're into growing your business, your commerce platform better be ready to sell wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout top brands like Allbirds use. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/podcast free, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/podcast free to upgrade your selling today.
You can support this podcast at patreon.com/partnersincrimemedia.
I'm Rebecca Lavoie, and this is Crime Writers On. Crime Writers On is the original true crime review podcast that digs into true crime, pop culture, other podcasts. And on this episode, her grandfather invented missiles for the Nazis. Decades later, a reporter sets off to learn about his role in the Third Reich and the potential revenge bombing that killed her grandmother. We'll discuss the podcast, The Man Who Calculated Death. Joining me to get that done and more is true crime author, TV journalist, and host of These Are Their Stories podcast, my husband and love of my life, Kevin Flynn. Hi, Kevin.
Hello, Rebecca.
Also with us is private investigator, certified pet detective, resident cat lady, and author of the Piper Green series of cozy mysteries, Laura Bricker. Hi, Laura.
Hey, Rebecca, and now proud owner of a Christmas tree inside a snow globe in my house. It's very exciting.
Can't wait to see that. Mm-hmm. And finally, our resident Doubting Thomas, author of the City Trilogy of novels, host of Rip Current, Strange Arrivals, and our Patreon Deep Dive Book Club podcast host, Toby Ball. Hi, Toby.
V-Gates, Rebecca.
Oh, wow. So I don't usually do this because it's a little bit peeling back the curtain to our process. And, we do put out 2 podcasts a week, but I will say, we record them one after another on the same day. And in between recording the previous podcast about Inside McCamey Manor, which, spoiler alert, we all fucking hated, and in this podcast that we're going to review right now, Toby said that this is one of the biggest contrasts we've ever had in 2 shows that we've ever recorded in 1 week or had to listen to in a week. So, Toby, what do you mean contrast? What are you talking about?
Well, it feels like this one, and as I assume we're about to talk about, is like this really considered, well thought out, introspective, journalistic enterprise, I guess, that really accomplishes something and it just sounds great and all this stuff. And is obviously very thoughtful versus the McCamey Manor thing, which was none of those things.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, it was sort of the opposite.
Yeah.
It was strange. Like literally, I listened to the end of McCamey Manor, took 10 minutes to kind of like mentally reset, listen to a little Allman Brothers. And then I put on this one and I was like, it's not even like the same medium.
Yeah.
It's just so different.
Whole different ball of wax. Kevin, I have a question for you real quick. Mm-hmm. Are you one of those guys, Kevin, that John Mulaney says is studying for the World War II exam that none of the rest of us knows is happening?
I think I just turned the age where I am. I'm actually reading the 1,000-page tome of The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. So, yeah, I haven't come up to the Robert Lusser chapter yet, but yeah.
Yeah, I've noticed that about
apparently
you.
so.
Yeah.
So I guess World War II is suddenly right in our lap.
I read a lot of historical fiction that takes place in World War II. So I guess I'm studying for that exam too, but the fictional version, Well, Kevin, this is the time in the podcast where I ask you, what is coming up on future editions of Crime Writers On?
Yeah, Monday we're going to talk about the Max documentary, Nature of the Crime.
What's that about?
It's about parole.
Okay. Well, I'm looking forward to that discussion, but I'm also looking forward to the discussion we're about to have. So shall we begin?
Let's do it.
Leading off.
And just like that, I make a promise. And my mom's story, which started 75 years ago in a country 6,000 miles away, becomes mine.
Her mother's dying wish was that her daughter complete her memoir about her childhood in Nazi Germany. That's how reporter Suzanne Rico learned a secret about her grandfather. Years before Robert Lusser was an American rocket designer, he was a German engineer who invented the V-1 flying bombs that rained down on London.
I think Mom often felt like she suffered, that's what she deserved.
Because her dad was
a Nazi scientist. And see what happened to the family?
Suzanne's grandmother was killed when Allied planes dropped bombs on their secluded farmhouse, a revenge attack her elderly aunts believe was targeting Lusser. Suzanne and her sister headed to Germany to make sense of their family history, investigate the 1945 bombing, and confront the legacy of a grandfather who played such a deadly role in the Third Reich.
The push-pull of emotion is hard to explain. On one hand, Rudy's confirmation that our grandfather made this bomb fly is nauseating. On the other, it's weirdly vindicating.
The Man Who Calculated Death from Discount Sushi and novel is part family memoir, part historical puzzle. We follow Suzanne's journey to uncover the mystery of her grandmother's death. And as she unearths more of her grandfather's story, she ponders what responsibility her family bears today for the horror of Lusser's flying bomb. Spoiler alert, we're going to be talking about pretty significant plot points from The Man Who Calculated Death. So if you want to remain spoiler-free, go to the estimated time code in our show notes for our thumbs up or thumbs down review. So Laura, this podcast begins where Suzanne begins, basically, talking to her mom before her mom dies. And we do get a chance to hear from her mom in the podcast. How do you think the podcast handles that, given other media that we've covered recently that didn't handle that kind of thing well?
Well, right off the bat, this is told from somebody that knows how to journalistically tell a story. She's like, this is what I knew about my mom. Like, she came here from Germany and she majored in English and she was extremely accomplished, writes a book and teaches and does all these things. But then she's dying and she leads into, it's like the perfect setup. Like, she leads into my mom's dying wish is this unfinished manuscript that she had. And she wants me to finish it.
One thing I would like you to do, and any one of you can do it if you want.
Our favorite storyteller asks us, her daughters, to finish the biggest story of all, her memoir.
I think what's really interesting about the way they lead into that is that there's a lot of preconceived ideas about what that story is based on the research her mother had done to date and based on sort of the story that Suzanne and her sister had been told, which was what they knew at the time. And
family
so I think
lore, right?
Family lore. Seriously, anybody can relate to that, I think. And so hearing that, and then that's your jumping off point, I think that it's very relatable to be in that position where you're like, now I'm going to find out the story of my family, and I have a reason to do it.
Now, Kevin, you have a note that I will just tip my hand and say I disagree with. Toby has the same note that you thought those scenes, the setup was too protracted.
Okay, so you're making me start off with my one critique.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Just get it out of the way.
Okay, so not to be brutal, but I probably would have cut down the story about her mother's prolonged story about her death.
The second version of it or the first version of it? Because we hear about it twice, at the beginning and then there's a later episode about it.
Yeah, I know, when Faulkner said, you have to kill your darlings, he wasn't thinking about mom, but narratively, her death is the inciting incident, and the story doesn't really pick up until you get to the search. So to be completely cold-blooded as an editor, I'd say you need to tell that part of the story, but we need to wrap that up so we can get to what the podcast is about. And as an editor, I would expect a lot of pushback on that because it's, we always talk about sometimes you fall in love with your research and, this is your mom's life. And so I get why that was there, but if I'm going to be critical, which is what we do if we're going to be critical of it, and this is just probably the worst thing I'm going to say about it, is just the story begins when Suzanne picks up the torch, and now we get going. So I think that we could have had maybe some less of that.
So Toby, there is family lore in the podcast, and I will say when I began listening to it, I was worried that there might be some soupçon of this balance of exploring the story of her grandfather, who was a Nazi actor, but he's also a great guy. And I was worried that it would get into this weird, quasi-apologist territory, and that's a very fine line to walk because she clearly is also proud of what her grandfather achieved in his life, right? So what do you think about the balance there of being like, granddad was smart, capable, really accomplished, and a Nazi?
Yeah, it's a tough one, quite honestly. This is funny because I in a different context, was just reading some stuff about Werner von Braun, who they end up being kind of rivals within the Nazi sort of flying machines of death thing in World War II. But it was sort of a similar thing, which was, well, he was a scientist, and in order to continue doing his science, he needed to join the Nazi party, or else that was going to be cut off from him. And that's essentially the story that happens here. And it gets told where he's going to get this professorship, and the guy who's conducting the interview or offering the job or whatever is like, this can be a lot smoother if you join the party, which he does. I think the hard thing is that both those guys, while positioning it as being sort of pursuing like science for its own sake, are actually end up making destructive weapons, like very advanced for the time weapons that they're going to use against primarily England. So yeah, it's a tough one. And I think it's smart in that you can kind of hear them struggle with it. And I think she struggles more than I would be comfortable with, quite honestly. Like, I think you've got to really overcome a shitload if the opposite side is, well, but at the same time, he's a Nazi. But I think the fact that you don't hear any kind of conclusion about it or sort of trying to add up the balance sheet or whatever, it's more you kind of hear her wrestling with that from time to time without coming to a real conclusion. I think that's probably about as good as you can do, unless you're just going to come straight out and just be like, I don't care about anything else. He was a Nazi and that's it.
Right.
It's a tough one. It's a really, really tough one. And I think that she didn't fumble it, which I think is about as good as you can do.
So Laura, Suzanne is very present in the podcast, and she's also an experienced broadcast journalist. And she brings her sister along for the detective part of the journey and the travel part of the journey. We hear her sister is also very accomplished. What do you think about this balance? Because as Toby was just saying, she's extremely vulnerable in the podcast. She's exploring things that she legitimately does not know where they will go, and they're about her. And they're about her family. So do you think she does a good job of being in the story that she's also covering?
I think she does. And I actually, because I was curious about her, I had actually looked her up, and there was actually an article about her kind of struggling with like, oh, I have to put myself in this story. It feels wrong. I'm a journalist. I'm supposed to be impartial, and how she worked through that process. And I think, number one, having her as the journalist, she's very good at her delivery of the story. She's very good at condensing the story. She's very good at telling the story. But she does put herself in the story in a way that is very effective in terms of talking about what it felt like when her mother was dying, talking about what it feels like when she and her sister are going off to begin investigating, talking about what it's like when she and her sister are with her aunts, talking about what it's like when she and her sister are out in like a cemetery, but also talking about her version of what she thought was happening versus the version that she is now reconciling with what she was told. And I think she does it in a way that is very authentic, but it's not over the top. And I think because of that, it's very effective in the way that it connects with you as the listener.
We also have more of her family in the podcast, Kevin. We have her aunts.
The Tantas.
Yes.
The Tantas, the one who doesn't drink but drinks.
Yeah, they're very present in the story because they also contribute after her mother's death to the family lore. So she actually goes to them as sources. They're not just characters in the story, right? They're also sources for some of the story.
Yeah.
What do you think about their family presence here?
How do you not love the Tantas?
I love
crying
them.
out, you know?
Don't let their ages fool you.
Heck, I got lost on an uninhabitable island in the Galapagos. I hiked to Machu Picchu via the Inca Trail, and I went to Burning Man in Nevada at the age of 78 and had my boobs painted.
I mean, what a blessing to still have them around, but also to have them in the story and to be, to the extent that they can be reliable narrators. They were good sources of information to tell the family story. And that's sort of like what is interesting at the end is that their perception of it isn't the reality of it. So it does, for us as listeners, it becomes a twist for us. But as far as the Tantas themselves, I mean, so wonderful. I thought it really interesting at the end when Suzanne presents to them the evidence that she has that the family lore is incorrect, that the fact that these bombs landed on their secluded farmhouse has nothing to do with their father having been this Nazi scientist. It wasn't a targeted revenge attack, as they have believed their entire lives, right? It is their truth. And to say, no, it was a plane was in distress, they had to dump his bombs, everybody flew out. Like, wow, that's really interesting. Like, that should have shattered their world, right? But they were more like, well, that's really good to know, you know? It's like, that's glad that was solved, you know? It's like...
But when you hear what they lived through, doesn't that make sense? Like, their childhood was harrowing.
Oh, yeah.
They were living in Nazi Germany. Her mother lived in Nazi Germany. They were in the house when it was bombed.
Oh, yeah. It's not like the fact that, like, their father was a great aviator and you find out later, no, he actually wasn't. Oh, you know, too bad. I mean, the whole thing about having lived through a war and then, you know, having your mother get killed, you know, in this horrible way. And then, you know, just like what ended up happening to them afterwards before they get to the United States. I mean, that is just really so traumatic and character forming. Like, that's the kind of thing like that informed their lives there on out. So that's why the stakes are so really interesting in the family exploration part of this podcast, because it's a really fascinating skeleton in the closet, right? Grandpa, you know, was an important Nazi scientist. And so, well, what do I want to know about that? And, you know, if the mother hadn't asked, like, would you complete this project for me? How deep would they have gone into this? So, you know, we start off with this story that they provide about what happened. And they go to look and then they don't expect to sort of refute it. They expect to sort of find more answers that back up that story. I mean, it's serendipitous, but it ends up making for a much more enjoyable and surprising narrative for us.
This podcast goes in a lot of directions, Toby, like a lot. You know, Suzanne follows things where they lead her, and then she takes us with her as she's following threads. One of the threads is this historical thread. The aunt's are still alive. She also got all the stories from her mom. They were living in Germany. They specifically remember also toward the end of the war when they were starving. They at one point were sent to an orphanage. What did you think of that passage in the podcast? Because it's certainly like a glimpse inside Nazi Germany to, like, for lack of a better word, what citizens sort of were experiencing. It was, I thought, very interesting part of the story. What did you think, Toby?
Yeah, I mean, I thought that was honestly sort of the best part of it for me. It's sort of a more sort of modern style of looking at history rather than just looking at World War II as being a bunch of generals and leaders and battles and stuff, but what's happening to other people who are non-combatants in the war. And, you know, without stating the obvious, it's not good for anybody, but you get a very detailed kind of description of these people who, you know, they were part of the elite to a certain extent. I mean, the husband is one of the top aviation engineers in the country and is doing work on sort of the joint most important project that they have going. So it's not as though these are like common people who don't have any access to anything. And still their lives are just, you know, being a child during wartime is not great for anybody. And as you start to lose the war, and they talk very briefly about this, but the idea that there are no like able-bodied men around because they're all either dead or still fighting, just like details like that about how different from normal life during wartime is. So I thought that was very kind of affecting. You know, that's a little bit sort of the counterpoint to the stuff about the grandfather, and that, you know, when you're 8 years old, I mean, they talk about how much they hated going to these like kinder camps or whatever.
The Hitler Youth Camp, yeah. They hated it.
Yeah, but, you know, whether they hated it or not, when you're 8 years old, it's hard to make like very informed political decisions.
Yeah,
it wasn't,
I don't think it was based on politics for them when they were 8. It was based on the fact that there was only one nice lady working there, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. And they kind of had to go. So I thought that was, to me, the most interesting part.
You know where there's a lot of interesting stuff, Kevin?
Where?
On our Patreon.
Oh, is that what you're getting at?
That's
Patreon.
What I was getting at, yes.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Now you can join us on Patreon for more exclusive content at patreon.com/partnersincrimemedia. All of our patrons, we're all getting together next week, December 18th. I think that's next week. December 18th, 8 p.m. Eastern Time. We're having our annual Crime Writers on Patron holiday party. It's going to be a virtual party. We always ask you, hey, bring a nice holiday beverage. We're going to sit around. We're going to bring people up on the screen if I can figure out how buttons work. And like always, we'll talk a little bit about what we're doing for Christmas and just a chance to, get together. Thank you for everything that you've done and just enjoy the holiday, because we always have great stuff that we're trying to say thank you for supporting us. It includes exclusive podcasts like the Crime Writers on After Show, Toby Ball's Deep Dive Book Club podcast. Right now, Toby's podcast is covering the book The Sullivanians, and the next one is A Threat to Violence by Mark O'Connell. Rebecca, we have Married with Podcast, which is our advice show, and you also have a special podcast called The Readathon, which is your regular updates about the Karen Reed case.
So much is happening right now. It's a good time to listen to The Readathon because there's a lot going on as the trial stuff, the pre-trial stuff is ramping up.
Laura Bricker has the Leave It to Bricker podcast, and if you join us at the Let's Do What We Do level, you can get episodes of Crime Writers on early and ad-free. So as you're finishing up your holiday shopping, we'd urge you to use our Amazon storefront, where you can see some of our favorite things. Now, Rebecca, could you tell us what are this week's Amazon recommendations?
Yeah, I just got an awesome, totally not lame keychain that holds my Apple AirTag. I had one before that was always falling off of my keys, which is literally the opposite of what a thing that's supposed to track your keys does.
Fortunately, you're able to later to find the tag.
But I just got one that's beautiful and functional and does not fall off my keychain, and I will put a link to it in our storefront.
And Toby, what are your listener-inspired Toby Ball's deep cut recommendations?
I'm going to start off going literary. Connor, A Hockey Romance.
Ooh.
Glendale Magic, Book 1.
Wow.
Hockey romance.
By the way, I actually, I've listened to that book.
You have?
What?
I've listened, yeah. It's a modern romance about men. It's wonderful.
Oh, is there high sticking involved?
Oh, my God.
Snapshot.
And then the next one is simply Red Onion.
Oh, somebody got a red onion. I suspect I know who that is.
I have a guess.
Oh,
we have
wow.
a listener who buys one vegetable at a time and has it shipped to their house from Amazon.
And I seem to read them quite often.
In her defense, there's a lot more than just the onion, but yeah. So when you're shopping for your Christmas gifts, your hot, kinky love novels, or your groceries, shop us first at amazon.com/shop/Crime Writers On. We earn commissions on qualified purchases.
So, Kevin, before we wrap up this esteemed business section, do we have any Patreon patron saints of the week this week?
Our Patreon patron saints are Michelle Nickram and Angela Mann. Bless you.
Bless you, Michelle. Bless you, Angela.
And again, I want to say that these folks here, Michelle and Angela, have supported us from the very beginning.
Wow.
8 years ago, they were among the first and are still with us. And like, this Patreon thing, this is kind of random, and there's no really reward for it. It's just very nice. People like to hear their name. And I'll just say, I'm trying to go back and just kind of flag some folks who have been with us for a very long time and haven't been recognized. And I was like very surprised and chagrined that we had not gotten around to Michelle and Angela after everything that they've done.
Do you keep a spreadsheet of past Patreon patron saints? You're able to look them up?
Well, I do, yes.
Amazing. You're so organized. What a good EP you are. All right, Kevin, does thus end our business section?
Thus ends the business section.
I'm going to go ahead and fade that music out right now. So, Toby.
Yep.
Who's our next sponsor for this program?
Toby doesn't know.
Oh, he doesn't?
He doesn't. Why would you be asking him?
That's a good point.
Yeah, okay, so we're sponsored by our friends over at Quince.
Oh, my fave.
Yeah, why is gift giving so enjoyable?
Because it feels good to have people open stuff that they like.
Yeah, right. So so I'm sorry, that was a rhetorical question that I was supposed to answer. Like, why is it enjoyable for me? Because I'm kind of bad at giving gifts.
You're very bad at it.
So, like, to have a nice prompt for something, especially when it comes to clothing, because I think as a dude, we can agree that it's sometimes hard to pick out, like, really great stuff. But it's all, what makes a great outfit is not just something that looks good on you, but a little bit of luxury, right? So you get quality gifts at an affordable price for Quince. Now, as much as I like giving gifts, I like giving myself stuff.
You also like getting gifts.
I like getting gifts. You know what I just did? I bought a pair of joggers from Quince.
You love those
for under
joggers.
$50.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've never had joggers before, and so they really like how they fit and they look. But Quince has a whole bunch of stuff for under $50. It is perfect for the holiday season. Plus, it's really quality stuff.
Gift luxury this holiday season without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/crime.
Crime!
For 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/crime.
Crime!
To get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/crime.
Crime.
Why get all your holiday decorations delivered through Instacart? Because maybe you only bought 2 wreaths, but have 12 windows. Or maybe your toddler got very eager with the advent calendar. Or maybe the inflatable snowman didn't make it through the snowstorm. Or maybe the twinkle lights aren't twinkling. Whatever the reason this season, Instacart's here for hosts and their whole holiday haul. Get decorations from the Home Depot, CVS, and more through Instacart and enjoy free delivery on your first 3 orders. Service fees and terms apply.
Holiday magic is in the air, and DSW's got all the shoes to make your season extra merry. Believe, you've got parties to attend and lists to check twice, so DSW is taking care of the details, like gifts to make their eyes all aglow, styles that bring joy to your world, brands everyone wants, like UGG, Nike, Birkenstock, and more, and deals to make your budget bright. Find the perfect shoes for you and yours at a DSW store near you or dsw.com.
So, Laura, before the break, we were talking about this exploration into Suzanne's family history. And we hear this whole passage where she and her sister go to Germany and they learn a lot and they sort of are also processing a lot. What do you think about the idea of doing that, going back to a place where obviously it was sort of this Nazi history, but also this very personal family history, and then trying to unspool that for listeners in the podcast?
So as somebody who has a complicated family history themselves, I think this is so cool. Like I was listening to this and I was like, oh, like I would like to do this, but I would need to have a reason to do this, right? Like they had a reason. They had sort of the jumping off point with their mother passing away, but being able to like actually go to where your ancestors came from in the position of a journalist where you're used to asking questions, investigate, find the people that were there at the time that this happened, dig into their lives, find out what actually happened. And then in this case, I think what I was finding really interesting was then they're kind of struggling with the connection of their grandfather to the Nazi party and like what was his role there and what was actually happening. And they had heard stories, but now they're actually able to go to the actual physical place. And I think that could be a little bit overwhelming to go to the actual physical place like that. But at the same time, what an amazing opportunity.
Yeah, we're right here. This is where Hilda stayed with all the kids.
Oh my gosh.
But it's crazy because the house looks exactly like it does in the old.
So do you think that really this was the exact room or a piece of the room, or
they built it, they rebuilt it exactly the same?
I just found that whole part super interesting. So they begin at their mother's childhood home. They are like, we're the granddaughters of a guy who created weapons of mass destruction.
And they lived in an architecturally gorgeous Bauhaus house.
Yeah. Like our grandfather worked for the Nazis. Like, what is our responsibility here? What is our role here? Like, how should we feel about this? Because even though it wasn't them involved, it's their family legacy. So they go through letters and photographs and they go through home movies and they go through this whole journey of trying to figure out what actually happened. And I would love to do this at some point. I think it's a really interesting sort of cathartic process to go through. But at the same time, I think it could be a pretty heavy process. And I think you probably have to be at the right time in your life to do something like that, if that makes sense.
The thing I was really surprised by was the accuracy of her mother and her aunt's memories about various things. I expected there to be many points in the podcast where she realizes that family lore is in fact family lore and that they were kids at the time. And so things weren't exactly as they said. The aunt knew the exact time those bombs drop, and she is later able to confirm the time the bombs dropped, and they lined up exactly, 2 minutes apart?
2 minutes off, yeah.
1:35 by 1:37. They went to the farmhouse. The aunts remember hearing a certain number of explosions. There's exactly that number of craters at the farmhouse. Like, what they are able to put together.
And the way the plane fell out of formation.
Oh, exactly.
Where it looked like it was making an attack run, and then Right, and then later she's able to describe that to the Air Force historian dude, and he's like, well, that's what would have happened if X. So it's really incredible, because I really expected those childhood memories to be debunked and this to be kind of like one of those stories. But they do discover something new, Toby, which is that, Suzanne and her sister were really struggling with the fact that obviously their grandfather had invented this war machine that benefited the Nazis and killed a lot of people, particularly in England. But then they also learn about Dora, the camp where the bombs were built, and the underground basically operation of enslavement that was happening there to build the missiles. What did you think of that section, Toby, that sort of learning section and getting that darker part of the history?
I had kind of mixed feelings, to be honest with you. I mean, I think it was interesting and necessary, and I think it was important to sort of drive home the facts of Nazi Germany. There was slave labor at this place, Dora, this, I guess you'd call it a manufacturing place, but the people who got there had a 6 to 8 week life expectancy. And again, it feels funny, like criticizing this after the thing we just did earlier this week, but there were times when I was like, did you not do like a little basic research before you showed up? Like there are times when she's sort of expressing surprise or dismay or whatever about things that I think were very knowable beforehand. And I don't know if they went in just cold and were like, oh, we'll find out what we find out on tape, or whether it was just the fact of being there was so emotionally overwhelming or what. But there were times I was like, wait, you didn't know that?
A lot of younger people don't know stuff, Toby. And it's also for the benefit of those listeners too, right? Who don't know stuff. And
but they're also not making podcasts about it, right? I mean, anyway, whatever. I mean, it's a small criticism, but there are a few times when I was like, yeah, it was Nazis. Like that was the shit they did. Like it was utterly depraved. But yeah, I mean, there's the emotional impact that you feel on them of visiting this place that, wasn't created by their grandfather, but was carrying out their grandfather's designs, like literally. Again, it's like on the one hand, you've got this guy who's probably a genius and, a great scientist and stuff. On the other hand, just the mass human suffering that results from his work. It's like, how do you make an accounting of that?
Yeah, I was kind of thinking the same thing, Toby, that I would have liked to hear a little more about the rhetorical questions that, they sort of bring up, like what responsibility do the descendants bear for the deeds of their relatives? And, how she thought about it, maybe had a discussion like with her sister on tape to kind of go into that a little deeper. Like we heard in the past, like I'm thinking of the Deep South podcast where they have an old lady and her great something grandfather owned a plantation with enslaved people. And she's like, oh, but they were well treated. And it's like, okay, you don't have to take the blame for slavery, but be a little more thoughtful about it. And I do think that Suzanne was thoughtful about it, especially when she meets that concentration camp survivor who was forced to build the V1.
And I feel very much like I want to apologize and tell you that I'm so sorry.
Well, I appreciate it. It's nice to hear it from a German person.
It occurred to me very not early on, but towards the middle and the end, that what could have happened with this body, just like the idea could have been a case of displacement, which is when the planes jettison their payload and their fuel so that they're light enough to land. You don't blow out your tires, right? And, the cinematic twist is that the plane was actually just in distress.
Right.
And it wasn't an act, certainly from the ground, it looks like you're coming to attack me.
And there's all these confirmation bias facts, like soldiers coming through asking about the farmhouse and stuff. Yeah.
Right. Certainly give us a solid answer. So exploring what happened and then like trying to figure out all these people on board. Like,
we'll talk about that.
Yeah. I just think that it's, another philosophical thing is it reminds me of that sort of ethical dilemma about runaway train, you pull the switch and is it going to kill the 6 people or what, that it's a little bit like that where they needed to bail all this stuff out and drop it, which resulted in death.
And they did it in the middle of nowhere.
In the middle of nowhere, which, if it were over a city, they would do the same thing. But they needed to do that in order to save those lives. That's like a good like chin scratcher when you're thinking about, well, is it fate evening the scales? How do we feel about that? Do you feel, for lack of a term, better knowing that the reason that your grandmother died was in service of saving 10 other lives. I mean, there's something like really interesting to pick apart there. And I was kind of like hoping they'd go a little deeper in that, but that's just, I mean, I think this is so good is that like we are picking nits because that's all that's left to really like pick at is just these little things. But I thought that was really great.
I loved it that they didn't do that. I loved it that there was no ham-fisted reflection. I loved it. I inferred that, and Laura, I'm going to ask you about this in a second, that huge turn the podcast makes at the end is when she hears what happened and the historian comes in and he has the records of the mission and so forth. She then, thinks that all those guys were MIA. There's no record of them after that, military records. And then she decides to find out if that's true, like what happened to them. And she finds every single one of them. And to me, I was able to infer like there is some redemptive story coming from this fact that her family was traumatized in this way and that her grandmother died. Every single one of those men came home and had like full lives. She talked to their kids. And Laura, we hear her doing reporter cold calls to try to chase down this information. And she's like good at doing the cold calls. She has a lot of hangups and so forth. But what did you think of that? Because I just kept thinking about all the podcasts like we've listened to where people like set out to solve it, impossible to solve mystery. And of course they don't. And I'm like, oh my God, someone knows something in this podcast. It's like the opposite. What were your thoughts?
Someone knows something. I was like, this is pretty freaking amazing because how many times have we gone into a podcast and how many times have we reviewed a podcast where at the end we're super frustrated because there's no actual resolution that feels satisfying. And we're like, well, they did this whole story and that was great, but like we don't really have any information at the end that makes us feel like the journey was worthwhile other than just the journey. To actually have a answer to this farmhouse bombing and an answer to what happened was amazing. And then she's able to then use these documents to kind of do this investigation, take everything that she thought she knew about the farmhouse bombing. And it's like, nope, that's not actually what happened. And I think going through and hearing from those people and they'd be like, yeah, no, I was here and I was there. And then this happened and then that happened. And I think her candor in talking to these people, it was a kind of a satisfying conclusion because there was that story that she thought she was going to find, and that was not at all what she found. But actually the story that she found, I think was probably for her own personal sort of peace of mind, much more sort of just like, okay, this is what happened. And now I can know that part of my family's history.
Toby, were you surprised that she was able to track down every single one of those people?
Yeah, I was. It was sort of a strange quest, right? The connection between them and her family is really just an accident of timing of when they let loose those bombs, right? I mean, they weren't a target. If they let the bombs go a second later, they just would have landed in a field somewhere. So I guess it's kind of like trying to find out what happened to some people you were in a car accident with, a long time ago, because it's just sort of that random. What people find cathartic, I don't question that. So if that was something that was important for her to get some closure on it, and I just think it's like a journalistic and historical exercise, that it's pretty amazing that she was able to pull it off. So I guess I didn't find that part of it quite as intriguing as a lot of the other parts, because it was sort of like, oh, what happened to these guys? Oh, well, it's good it all worked out for them. I was going to ask one question because I don't think I wrote it down, but as we've talked about it, it's sort of popped up. There's a scene where they go on maybe it's when they go on the tour of Dora, but she talks to her tour leader and asks her kind of like, does she feel like some sense of guilt, or how does she sort of process all this?
How I feel about it.
I mean, do you feel shame? Do you feel, you have to stand here and you have to explain what some Germans did that is horrifying.
I think I don't know the English word who can explain how I feel about it.
When I heard that, I was like, okay, it's interesting hearing an American of German descent asking a German that question, since your ancestors were at the same place at the same time. So the idea that because she's actually German, her answer would be different than yours as an American, that kind of stopped me for a second. I was like, I feel like there's a lot more to unpack there than maybe was done in this. It just seemed like a very, very odd question to me. And I don't know if she was trying to figure out how she should be kind of conceiving of it as somebody who's sort of away from, whatever national angst there is at this point about it. Like, I couldn't quite wrap my head around what was going on there, but they included it and it seemed kind of important to me in some way.
What I thought, Toby, when I heard that scene was her actually trying to answer that question. Like, is it different for me than it is for this person who grew up here? I mean, one thing that I know about Germany, but my son was an exchange student there, is that there's a ton of stuff in schools about the Nazi Party and the Third Reich and the Second World War. And there are things in Germany that are actually like illegal. Nazi paraphernalia is illegal. Like, there's stuff that's like very much in the culture and in the country about the World War II experience. And of course, there are also not neo-Nazis in Germany. I mean, I'm not saying that Germany is not like free of its own Nazis, but I think that for me, when I heard that, it wasn't how am I supposed to feel about it. It's that, is your experience of this as a younger person substantively different than mine? Because in so many ways, like, she did grow up in a German home. Like, we hear her sister singing German songs. Her sister speaks German. Like, the culture of the German childhood that her mother had and her aunts had is very much like ingrained in her. So I think maybe she was trying to figure out if that question actually is a different question in the United States versus Germany. That's kind of what I took away from it.
The holidays are all about sharing with family. Meals, couches, stories, grandma's secret pecan pie recipe. And now you can also share a cart with Instacart's family carts. Everyone can add what they want to one group cart from wherever they are. So you don't have to go from room to find out who wants cranberry sauce, or whether you should get mini marshmallows for the yams, or collecting votes for sugar cookies versus shortbread. Just share a cart, and then share the meals and the moments. Download the Instacart app and get delivery in as fast as 30 minutes, plus enjoy free delivery on your first 3 orders. Service fees and terms apply.
Nobody does selling better than Shopify, home of the #1 checkout on the planet. The Shop Pay feature even boosts conversions up to 50%. So if you're into growing your business, your commerce platform better be ready to sell wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout top brands like Allbirds use. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/podcastfree, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/podcastfree to upgrade your selling today.
All right, let's do what we do. Let's let our listeners know, should they check out the podcast, The Man Who Calculated Death? Laura Bricker, thumbs up or thumbs down for this podcast?
Yeah, this is a thumbs up. There was a lot going into this that makes it a thumbs up. We have a journalist telling a story who is somebody that is very good at telling a story. It's her personal story. She puts herself in the story. It's a historical story about Nazi Germany. So there's a lot of history in there. And it's also her family's story in Nazi Germany that she is re-examining. And I think all of that in the way that it is told really combines in a way that is very compelling, that is very interesting, that is very relatable. Like, anybody that wants to know about their family history and has ever been like, geez, I wish I knew about my family history, can relate to the journey that the host of this podcast goes on to look into her grandmother's death and her grandfather's role in the Nazi Party. And it was hard to listen to, but it was told in such a way that the narrative flowed and you followed along. And when you left it, you're like, wow. There was some parts that could have been edited, but at the same time, at the end, I think this was a very well done podcast.
Toby Ball, thumbs up or thumbs down for The Man Who Calculated Death?
Yeah, I like this a lot too. It's got an interesting rhythm to it, I guess, in that, there's a lot of sort of conversational type stuff. I mean, there's also interview things, but there's just a lot of conversations between Suzanne and particularly her aunts, and then I guess her sister too. And that sort of interspersed with interviews, a tiny bit of archival audio, and then the sort of narrative parts are sort of more, I would say, literarily written. I don't think that's an actual word. They have a more literary bent to them than what we're used to. So in some ways, at times it feels almost like an audio book, like somebody's reading something like an essay or a memoir that somebody's written, which is fine. Yeah, it's World War II. I mean, there's a lot of really tragic and upsetting and terrible things. And for me, the part that I really liked was sort of hearing about normal people's lives in Germany during that period. But there's a lot more to it than just that. I mean, there's a lot of history, there's detective work, journalism, all this stuff. Laura kind of covered that. So anyway, this was really good. I give it a big thumbs up.
Kevin Flynn.
Yeah, I'm also a big thumbs up. There's a little bit of DNA shared between this podcast and the last season of In the Dark. Just a more intimate investigation into a fog of war mystery, but also told as a family journey story. So like Suzanne and Stephanie's journey become our journey. So this covers Robert Lusser's history and the early part of his legacy. But this season is really the story of his wife, Hildy. But I guess the wife of the man who calculated death doesn't have the same ring to it. But, it's just a really fascinating journey that we go on, a historical mystery. So many things get revealed that we don't expect to get revealed. And for a podcast that is primarily a story about war and death and Nazism, this is surprisingly life-affirming. And so I'm really saying folks should listen to it. It's a big thumbs up.
This podcast is a huge thumbs up for me. I think I may have liked it even more than all of you did. To me, it shares DNA with Witnessed, Devil in the Ditch, where, Larison Campbell in that podcast, who's also a great writer, great host, and actually Suzanne reminded me a little bit of her stylistically. She is grappling with, she's trying to solve this mystery ostensibly of her grandmother's murder, but she's also grappling with her identity as a Southerner. And especially a Southerner who comes from a family with money. And so to me, it shares a little bit of that storytelling DNA. The life affirming part, Kevin, I'm so glad you said that. Hearing those sisters working together, hearing Suzanne working with her niece, hearing how this family is so like a unit and shares so much and spends so much time together is incredibly life-affirming. As you get the sense that like she's pulling out her microphone and it's not like I haven't seen you in 6 months and now I'm going to interview you. Like I saw you yesterday and we agreed that you talk about this. And it's
the surprising people you meet along the way.
It's incredible. I also think this podcast is an important listen right now, today, because part of the debate being brought up by white supremacists and modern Nazis is that we are no way responsible for things that happened in the past. Like it comes up with slavery and reparations. It comes up with Nazi Germany, the Holocaust. And it's like, that's not my fault. I had nothing to do with it. That was my grandfather, my great-great-grandfather. This is an important fucking conversation because Suzanne's whole life was informed by this history. Her privilege was informed by this history. Her aunt's, horrible childhood was informed by this history. There is a thread between people today and things that our ancestors did, just like there's a thread of trauma when our ancestors had it. Like, it's something that we should be talking about. I will just say finally that the fact that she goes down this incredibly deep rabbit hole and actually accomplishes a shit ton, and we've heard so many podcasts where reporters have gone down deep, twisty rabbit holes and found nothing, is fascinating to me. And as for the style of it sounding like a book, she promised her mom she'd finish a book, and she did. Like, this thing is both a podcast and a book, but like in a good way. And I just absolutely loved it stylistically. I thought it was beautifully made. All right, that's going to do it for us. But before we go, Laura Bricker, do we have a cat of the week this week?
Our cat of the week this week comes to us from our regular longtime listener, Shirley Lero. Dr. Shirley Lero.
Hey.
Dr. Lero, frequent guest on Toby Ball's Deep Dive Book Club.
She's the best.
Unfortunately, I don't know Shirley's cat's name. I got a very nice picture of Shirley's cat. And Shirley's about to order some Ernie L's cat food toppers.
Nice.
Don't judge her.
Nice.
You can probably get them in the Crime Writers on Amazon shop.
Okay. Ernie L's cat food toppers.
Also, I'm a fan because, I love orange cats.
Yep.
Orange male cats. I don't know if this is a male cat, but it is an orange cat. My orange cat's number one, Rocky Flintstone. Very nice, lovable cat. Pippin the Wonder Kitten. Looks like he's eaten a turkey recently. Shirley Lero's orange cat looks like kind of a cross between Pippin and Rocky right now. And orange cats are the best. Someday I'll know your cat's name. Now I don't, but I love that you're ordering the cat food toppers.
All right, Laura, if Shirley wants to reach out to you on social media and tell you what her cat's name is, how can you be found online?
You can find me at Laura Bricker on Instagram and the Blue Sky.
What about you, Toby? How can you be found?
At TobyBallNH on Blue Sky or Twitter, which I'm never on anymore.
What about you, Kevin?
I'm at Kevin Flynn on Blue Sky and Kevin P. Flynn elsewhere.
Yeah, I'm Reb Lavoie everywhere, and I encourage you, if you haven't made the transition to Blue Sky yet, or even if you've never been on Twitter, it's an awesome platform. It's like how a social platform should work, and so you should join, and you should follow the show, and you should follow all of us. We're at crimewriterson.com because Kevin got that account verified.
No blue check, but
nice
just
job.
that. Yeah.
Get episodes early and ad-free at patreon.com/Partners in Crime Media. You'll get all the great stuff we make back there. Our theme song was composed and performed by Tyler Gibbons. Our line editor is the wonderful Livy Burdett. The EP of this show is Kevin Flynn. This show was recorded in Studio C, The Closet, in our New Hampshire basement, where we also keep our darkest family secrets well hidden away. On behalf of all the crime writers, thanks so much for listening. We will catch you later.
You know, it covers Robert Lusser's history and the early part of his legacy.
It's Lusser, by the way.
Lusser? What did I say?
Lusser. You said Lusser.
All right. So this covers the early part of Robert Lusser's... Lesser. Like lesser than?
That
right,
guy,
but you keep saying Lusser.
Yeah.
Okay,
Their
it's a you.
grandfather,
Okay,
that
I'm sorry.
dude.
Yeah. Lesser, okay.
Partners in Crime Media.
Nobody does selling better than Shopify, home of the #1 checkout on the planet. The Shop Pay feature even boosts conversions up to 50%. So if you're into growing your business, your commerce platform better be ready to sell wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout top brands like Allbirds use. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/podcast free, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/podcast free to upgrade your selling today.